Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This is a Science and Technology Innovation Program Commons Lab event. We're here today to celebrate the rollout of the report National Broadband Map, a case study on open innovation for national policy. And to start off the morning, I'd like to introduce Hailey Van Dyke, who works with the U.S. Chief Information Officer, where her policy portfolio covers open data, online mobile technologies. She is the lead for the Digital Government Strategy, a directive issued by President Obama aimed at delivering better digital services to the American people. Van Dyke has worked in the intersection of government, technology, and online engagement in many capacities. As USAID's Director of Digital Strategy and Engagement, she launched the agency's first public engagement campaign. The FWD campaign focused on raising awareness for famine, war, and drought devastating the Horn of Africa. She also served as the Director of Citizen Engagement on the first new media department at the Federal Communications Commission, hailed by the Washington Post as the most forward of the Obama administration's agencies to grasp Web 2.0. Van Dyke was a member of the Presidential Transition Team, working with the Technological Innovation and Government Reform Policy Group. During the 2008 presidential election, she worked on new media team of the Obama for America campaign within their Chicago headquarters. So I'd like to welcome Haley Van Dyke, and afterwards Zach Bastian and Michael Byrne from the Federal Communications Commissions will be moderating the rest of the event. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. This is a really fun day for me because I get a nice collision of my worlds here working with the eGov office for the federal CIO and a bunch of old colleagues here from the FCC. So this is a very, very fun day. But congratulations on the case study. I think it was absolutely beautiful written case study, and it's something I am personally going to carry around with me to all of my agency visits going forward, because I think it is just a model for how we need to be looking at federal IT across the board here. But one of my favorite lines in the case study actually was, oh, sorry, can you guys all hear me okay? Perfect, sorry about that. But one of my favorite lines in the case study, which I think really embodies so much of what we're trying to do here today, is that it is impossible to create government required for the 21st century while maintaining the infrastructure and procedures of the 20th century. And to me, that is one of the things that the map just did so well, and is what has pulled, I think, this wonderful group of panelists here today. These are all innovators in that space, and I'm very much looking forward to conversations with everybody here today, with these people who are working not just to figure out how we could use technology more innovatively in government, but also break that paradigm of using it to fix our infrastructure and also the procedures and update our government for the 21st century. So the office that I work in at OMB, the main goal that we have is to leverage technology better to serve the American people and make government more efficient. To that end, earlier this year, the president launched, in conjunction with Steve Van Rokel, our CIO, the Digital Government Strategy. The strategy itself is a behemoth of a document, but I definitely suggest checking it out if you haven't seen it yet. It's broken up into a 12-month roadmap that's focused on giving very discrete, actionable milestones to both agencies and central government to figure out how we can modernize the way that we use technology as a government to better serve the public in this, in the new constraints and opportunities that we're living in with technology today. The strategy itself has three main objectives. The first is that we make government services available to citizens anywhere, anytime, on any device. We also want to make sure that as we're moving into this new paradigm and this new world, that we're taking the opportunity to reevaluate how we manage, how we procure, and how we develop our services so we can do so safely, securely, and affordably. But the most important piece of the strategy, and one of the objectives that I'm most passionate about, is how we can unlock the power of government, of open data to spur innovation across the country. It's something that everybody in this room is very, very familiar with, and the value of. But at its very core, the strategy sort of focuses on not only the digital services that we provide to the public, but also how we build them. And it's a roadmap kind of reevaluating both of those and thinking about how we can reevaluate the paradigm in which we develop and provide the services themselves. You know, in today's world, as everyone knows, the public is used to buying airplane tickets online. We're used to booking doctor's appointments online, and in many cases, we use the internet now to stay in touch with our grandparents. And the citizens are at a point where they are expecting the same from government as is valid and as they should. And there's a lot of work that we need to do, frankly, to get ourselves to the point where we are on par with the private sector. There's pockets of excellence that are happening, and we're here to celebrate one of those. But the goal of the strategy was to figure out how we could make this momentum help the shift across government. The consumerization of technology really has been powerful in the last 2 decades in particular. As we look at the 1990s, the government started moving all of its services online, obviously, providing more services for access over the internet. Today, we're in a position where we're doing the same thing around mobile devices, but we're kind of at this, in my opinion at least, a very interesting inflection point, where the services themselves is now becoming open data. And it's something that's a bit of a new, it's a new thing for us. Data itself is becoming the service that government is providing, and it's changing the way that we have to think about how we build. Everyone knows the examples in this room of what happens when we can unleash government data in a way that allows the private sector to build on top of it and to kind of expand this innovation. GPS is a common example, weather is a common example. These are all things that we're familiar with here. But I think proof to part of that point is one of the facts that you mentioned to me the other day, which is that in the, and correct me if I get this wrong, but the National Broadband Map itself, the APIs are 4 times more used than the map, which I think is just case in point of data as a service being something that's a new space for the federal government and incredibly exciting and interesting. To that end, looking at data actually as the service now, we need to rethink how it is that we build the service. If that's becoming one of the new things we provide, we must kind of look internally and reflect on how government goes about building these IT systems. And the strategy itself takes a relatively wonky approach to describing exactly the steps that need to happen to help catalyze that reform. It focuses on a couple things. First is the decoupling of data and presentation, which is one of the other things that the map does so fantastically well. And by doing that, it enables data that we're using at a certain point in time to be used by the public, the private sector, or our own agencies at various points across the life cycle of this data. But the other thing that it really focuses on is architecting for openness from the start. So as we're building these new IT systems, we need to be baking in that concept that the data and the point of the system may transform and change over time. And part of what we struggle with today in government IT is we build these monolithic one-off systems for specific uses at specific points in time. And it's a byproduct of the kind of siloed environment that everybody that works in government is very familiar with. But it's not what we need to be building systems for in today's world to actually reach the 21st century services that we need to provide for our citizens. It creates wild inefficiencies, and we dump so much money into maintaining these old systems rather than leveraging open source technologies and kind of more agile software that will able to kind of maintain the points of the system over time more efficiently. One of the things that we're working on right now is called for in the strategy to help codify these principles is an open data policy for the U.S. government, which we're very excited to recently begin work on that will help kind of this transition and baking these principles into the start. But I'm incredibly excited to be here today with everybody who's played such a key role and created the National Broadband Map, which honestly, if there was a single IT poster child project for the digital strategy, it would be the National Broadband Map. From a technology perspective, it covered all the bases of where government IT needs to be going. Not only was it built and powered on open APIs, which is one of the main things called for in the strategy as well, it's built entirely off open source software, and the team used agile software development methodologies to deliver what was a very massive information technology project on very short timelines and very low budgets. But for those of us who work in federal IT in the room, we know that those accomplishments alone are something to be celebrated and are massive accomplishments. But the map did so much more than just do technology right. The map was not an exercise in technology for technology's sake. It shows really fundamentally what can happen when you integrate the use of open data and technology into the core mission of agencies, which to me is one of the most important examples and one of the most important reasons why this case study will be something that I carry around on all of my agency visits, because for so many, I think for so many different points in government, we don't actually take the time to integrate technology into the core mission of what we're doing. And it creates a little bit of a tail wagging the dog situation. And the map definitely, the processes that the National Broadband Map went through unravel that. It's also, I think, one of the most, the map itself fueled what has been to date and probably will be for quite a long time the most open and participatory process at the Federal Communications Commission. And that's because it also baked in by design into all of its core processes engagement with the public in a way that I think has used data, crowdsourced data, pulled that back into the system and republished that in a way that not many other federal agencies have grasped yet. But there's a lot of other examples in this space happening across government. USAID, actually, just if you haven't heard this case study, you should definitely check it out. It's one of my favorites. They had a massive data set, about 150,000 records of all of the loan data that they had been financing from across different parts of Africa and I think Asia as well. But the policy officials wanted to map the data. And the mapping team there was like, the data is such a mess. We use different metadata. We use different ways to describe location points throughout the data set. It's just impossible to map. So they leveraged the data.gov infrastructure and crowdsourced the data cleaning of nearly 150,000 individual data records. They set up a hackathon. They were going to do it over the weekend and get volunteers to come in from online, to participate online from across the world. They had over 16 countries participating, and they actually finished what they expected to have be done over 48 hours in 16 hours, leaving the rest of the weekend for participants. The USAID team was floored that it happened so quickly. When you're trying to describe to policy officials, like, no, there's people online who will actually help us clean data sets. I think they probably got looked at like they were crazy, and even more crazy when they told them that it happened in a fraction of the time that they thought. So there's wonderful examples of what is happening in this open data space. Another quick one is Census, actually just a few weeks ago, released a mobile application called America's Economy that's built on open APIs exposing data from BLS in addition to Census, and it provides this really beautiful mashup of job creation and economic growth in the United States. In the first 5 days that they had these APIs available, over 800 external developers had accessed the APIs. The users have generated over 24 million data calls or data requests. So this is just an indication of how much pent-up demand and how much value there is locked behind government IT, behind government data, and really exemplifies the need here for open data. But again, the National Broadband Plan is just such a gold standard, I think, in government today in how to architect these systems to actually serve these needs. And I am thrilled to be able to talk with the rest of the team here who worked on developing the map. So kudos to Mike Byrne and Zachary on the case study. I thought it was absolutely fabulous, and I'm thrilled to talk more.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Haley. Really appreciate everyone taking the time and joining us today. As Haley described it, we really do see this project as being the poster child for the digital strategy. There have been numerous awards and recognition for the project so far. Most recently, it was named IT Project of the Year by Government Computer News, which is a wonderful honor. And it continues to be a project that's being used in all the right ways. The Commons Lab exists to highlight the power of emerging technology in government, and so far this has included things like crowdsourcing, unlocking data, working to provide the power of GIS applied to federal problems. And the great thing about the National Broadband Map and what made it so interesting to us is it spoke to all these things. For this kind of project to happen, it took forward-thinking people at multiple levels, within the executive branch, within the agencies, within the private sector, and the citizens. And we might have ended up with a national broadband map without this type of universal buy-in, but it wouldn't be nearly as useful or influential. The whole project started with the National Broadband Plan, which identified a strong, reliable internet connection as a reliable indicator of economic opportunity. And when you can't get a reliable internet connection, that's an issue of digital divide, an issue of a gap of opportunity that prevents certain people from getting access to what they need to be able to progress. So the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act looked and directed the construction of a national map tracking internet connection strength to get a better idea of where the gaps really were and what we needed to address. So when that data collection began, that's the first point where the crowd that relies on their internet connection was mobilized. They did a lot to help with this project, and it wouldn't happen without them. 10,000 people volunteered to host SAM nodes units in their homes, which ran daily speed tests. People, including our panelist Ben right here, he has one of them still. Plenty of people also used the FCC mobile and desktop app, which provided more data. And then when the map was launched, if you see this graphic right here, this is actually a map tracking all the uses of the crowdsource utility. What the crowdsource utility has continued to do for the FCC is allow them to refine the results that they had so far from the project. If you go on the FCC broadband map and use the crowdsource utility, you can let them know, is my internet provider listed, and are the speed tiers that we have there accurate? So the results are continually being refined by the citizens. This kind of continuous interface and continuous participation shows that if the federal government makes a useful product, people notice and people use it. One of the other exciting things about this project to us is the fact that it's not just a tool that works, it also represents cost savings, it represents better efficiency. Everybody knows we're in a difficult economic situation, but when you have a tool that allows people to assess their internet connection strength and figure out what the best connection options are in their area, we're allowing them to get a better return on their investment. Because like Haley was talking about, people rely on their internet connection for all kinds of things, whether they're going to be working from home, getting an education online, staying in touch with family and friends. If we put this kind of hard open data at people's fingertips and allow anyone access it, it puts the government and private sector companies on notice, because when this data is accessible to anyone, either you're delivering the speed tiers that you're offering, that you're selling to people, or you're not. And if you're not matching, if your service isn't matching up with the numbers, then people are going to go to someone who does. The process that built the National Broadband Map was also innovative. They took several opportunities along the way to break from the traditional way that federal software procurement is done to save money and get a better, more efficient result. The first one that Haley mentioned was open source development. Proprietary software costs money, and it's not just the initial investment of buying the software itself, it's the continual investment of those licensing fees. By choosing to go open source stack top to bottom with the National Broadband Map, they've saved approximately $1 million a year in licensing fees. It's significant money. The other break that was a significant development is agile development. Agile development is an iterative process. You basically say, when you're building a software product, I'm adding a feature, I'm bringing it back to the user tests it, the user lets me know whether it works or whether it doesn't, then we add another feature. It's a gradual process, so step by step, features were added to the National Broadband Map, they communicated with the FCC and the NTIA, let them know whether it was what they needed, and they moved on from there. By building this software piece by piece, this is a remarkable break, because the traditional way that it's done is called waterfall. And the way that that works is that all the requirements have to be outlined at the outset. If the national, in the case of the National Broadband Map, they would have had to list every spec in advance, and then the programmers would take those specs, go and program, and bring the end product back to the user when it was completely done. The problem with this is when you're developing a software product for around a year, things are going to change within that year. And without the constant communication, you can end up with a lot of waste. Ben Balter did some work on this subject, and with his research, he found at times there are government procured software that ends up with 2/3 of the features gathering dust. So that's 2/3 of your tax dollars that have paid for things that are basically going unused. That's not acceptable, and agile development allowed a break from that bad result. But the process that built it was also open, and open data is a big priority for this. National Broadband Map was, and the work of this department in the FCC was recognized by the Department of Justice during Sunshine Week for their wonderful progress as far as keeping data open. Broader than that, the Open Government Directive told agencies that they needed to be implementing transparency, participation, and collaboration as organizing principles. So looking at the way that the broadband map came together, all those are in play here. Obviously, it's transparent. The data is here for anybody to use it, anybody to manipulate it, layer it however they like. Hailey mentioned the application programming interfaces that allow people to access this data and how they've been used, many times more than the map itself. The APIs have been used 35 million times in the last year alone, which shows that people are very interested in getting this data, playing with it, using it for their own purposes, which is why the FCC put it out there in the first place. The map itself was also very participatory. Obviously, this speed testing, all the information doesn't happen without citizens participating, without people like Ben volunteering to host a Sam Knows units or using the mobile app or
free router.
whatever your motives were. It worked out. But the fact is that people had to participate to make it work. And the process itself was also very collaborative. The NTIA collaborated with the states to set up the partnerships for data collections, and the states had to collaborate with their area internet providers. Then the National States Geographic Information Council provided tools that allowed the data collection to be honed and more accurate. The FCC provided speed testing and also technical know-how on these issues, and the citizens are constantly participating every step of the way, providing feedback through notice and comment, and the FCC and the NTIA are incorporating those results. When you have that many people in the room participating, continually working with each other, the results you're going to get are better, and that's what's been demonstrated with this project. Now, obviously, this project didn't solve everything. There's still a big issue of digital divide going on in this country. There's still people that don't have access to the opportunity that they need. Internet connections aren't strong as they need to be. But the fact is that this has had a tangible impact on policy. Beyond all the things that we've talked about so far, I think one of the best examples of the fact this project worked is that the dynamic demonstration of the gaps in internet connections in this GIS format has guided appropriations of the Connect America Fund. It's a significant amount of money. The first allotment was $300 million to connect up to 400,000 homes. If we're talking about addressing the digital divide, that's a tangible impact if we're talking about laying wire and making sure that people who currently don't have access to a robust internet connection, that we're working towards getting them there. Obviously, the panels that we have, I'm really excited that they were able to attend. I really appreciate it. They're going to have different things to say about the individual challenges that they're dealing with, where they see we can improve, where they see the gaps. But this kind of project shows that if you commit to the powers of opening your doors and opening your data, using geographic information systems to see where the gaps are, and harnessing the power of the crowd, reaching out to the citizens, directly interfacing them and seeing what their priorities are, you can get great results. Thanks so much for attending. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Michael Byrne. Michael is the Geographic Information Officer at the FCC. He absolutely made this project go and was really instrumental in getting everybody in the room. Thanks so much, Mike.
Well, I get the great honor of introducing the rest of the panel. So it was fun working with Zach here, and it was fun working on the map. But really, I'm fired up to hear what people have to say. So let me go through the introductions real quick, and then give everyone 3 to 5 minutes to just kind of respond. So on the far left-hand side, my far left-hand side, Mr. Greg Allen. Greg's the Chief Data Officer at the Federal Communications Commission, and has been instrumental in leading the Data Innovation Initiative at the FCC, an initiative really spearheaded to make sure that data is infused in policy and everything that we do there. In particular, Greg led the effort for the Broadcast Public Inspection File release, one of the biggest displays of public access data that we've had at the FCC, and instrumental in a whole bunch of other things. FCC Developer Day, APIs on fcc.gov/developer, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Greg was also the Chief Technology Evangelist at Sunlight, Chief Evangelist.
Chief Evangelist started,
Yeah.
the Sunlight Labs.
So a great role, great expertise that we have today. Next, we have Dr. Sean Gorman. Sean is currently the Chief Strategist for ESRI's DC Development Center, a founder of an organization here called GeoIQ, formerly 40S1. Sean, I was looking for the best way to describe Sean, and I think the best way is really data scientist, right? It kind of captures the full gamut of what Sean does. A big background in human geography, statistics, relief mapping, media output. Sean was one of the principals in building the platform, GeoCommons, and just done wonderful things with geospatial data and visualization. So thanks for being here, Sean. And finally, Mr. Ben Balter. Ben, as Zach has mentioned, is instrumental in ushering in a description of things like agile versus waterfall technology. But currently, Ben is one of the Presidential Innovation Fellows. I'm sorry? Sorry. One of the great things that I like to say about Ben is what Todd Park called Ben, which was lightning in a bottle when it comes to one of the descriptions of the Innovation Fellows. So Ben's passion and enthusiasm for open data I've witnessed personally, and it's sort of awe-inspiring. Author of the recent paper Towards a More Agile Development in Government that Zach mentioned. This paper was published in the Public Contract Law Journal earlier this year, I think, in springtime, something like that. So thank you all for being here. What I'd like to have each of you go through is about 3 to 5 minutes of just response. If you could focus on some of the takeaways that we've seen in the case study. What are some of the next steps in advancing government transparency when it comes to things like citizen engagement? And what issues are we facing, whether it's in things like highest levels in the executive office, like Ben's dealing with, or at an agency like FCC, or in the private sector. So, Greg, you want to kick it off?
So it's been my pleasure to work, I think, with basically everybody on this panel. So it's been very exciting. So I'm very interested in the specifics of how some of these big concepts happen. As the Chief Data Officer at the Federal Communication Commission and previously working at the Sunlight Foundation, there are these really powerful ideas that are out there, but there's still a lot about how does the rubber hit the road, what actually happens, and specifically kind of what happens organizationally, because I think some of the biggest challenges are not with the technology, but they're actually with people and with the organization. So I want to recount for my time up here some stories of Mike doing the National Broadband Map at the Federal Communications Commission. So Mike and I both arrived at the FCC within a week of each other. And Mike had this very big budget, had this very big project and a very short timeline. So what he actually did first was he put together a PowerPoint. And this was a 5-page PowerPoint, which boiled down to what he thought was the essence of what the law required the National Broadband Map to do. That it had to, I think you used to say it had to show location and it had to be interactive. It really, and Mike is very good about boiling it down to a couple points. So he had this 5-page PowerPoint, and he basically walked it around to a lot of people within the organization, just articulating this idea of what are we trying to accomplish, and this might be what it looked like. He had some very not attractive, hacked together representations of what the search page might look like and what the data page might look like, and he took it around to everybody and he kept refining it as he was going. And I thought that this was very important because what that PowerPoint led to next was a approximately 6-week prototype. So before a requirement was written, before an RFP went out, Mike shepherded a 6-week project to actually build a working prototype of the National Broadband Map with some data that already existed. So that idea of from PowerPoint to prototype as all a part of gathering requirements for the actual project. So, and then after that prototype was completed and it was a chance to investigate, let's build this on top of APIs, let's build this in an agile fashion, let's figure out what we're doing. There was now a working version of something. There was lessons that were learned and what was necessary to do, and then they went out and they solicited the contracts to do the development. And I think that that has been one thing that we've adopted, or we've tried to adopt in many more projects at the FCC, which is this notion of first you get a PowerPoint that's really simple, then you do a prototype, and you do these as part of gathering your requirements in order to figure out what you're trying to build. I think that what we have also found at the organization, and the map represents this case in point, it's much easier to do the innovation on greenfield projects as opposed to legacy systems, right? And I think related to that the legacy systems have proven much more challenging to kind of innovate, both organizationally and technology. technologically. So if you have a greenfield application, much easier to try to adopt some of these things. I think also, so now to kind of wrap up my little discussion of this. So what is the end result of some of this material? Now some of the first APIs that the FCC launched came from the National Broadband Project. And they were not really related to broadband directly, but they were related to the infrastructure of having a map and those tools. So the FCC, Mike, we actually released the first API for doing census block lookup, right? So once you have this API to do census block lookup where you can put in a census block, or you could put in maybe a step higher like a census tract or a county, and you could see the rest of the stack going up. Like this census block is in this tract is in this county is in this state, et cetera, et cetera. Now, once you have that, lots of things get very easy to do as you're building your application. Now, more than a year and a half later, when we were working on the public inspection file, all TV stations have to keep track of a certain number of documents, but some of the documents that they have to keep track of are political advertising documents. So they have to publicly disclose who's buying advertisements. So we wanted to make it really easy to keep the data as structured as possible without putting a big burden on television stations. So we wanted them to be able to create folders really easy, because we don't know what candidates might exist at the county level or at the city level. Like there might be a county sheriff, there might be a city dog catcher that's actually an elected position, and maybe they have to add documents for that. So the point is that we were able to create for the TV stations who are uploading documents, we were able to give them autocomplete where they could say, once we knew that they were in Illinois and they wanted to add a county, we could give them an autocomplete of all of the counties that were in the state of Illinois via the API that exists with the National Broadband Map. So because this geographic API existed as part of delivering the functionality of the API map, we were able to build in a single day an autocomplete feature in an entirely different application, which ensured that everybody would spell the county names correctly when they were creating folders or creating candidates, and that they would be able to complete that field much faster. We weren't creating big scroll down lists of county names. Didn't have to think about it all. We just had to go over to the API. So I think that that's kind of some of the specifics and power of what's possible with these approaches.
Thanks, Greg. Sean?
Oh, thanks for having me. It's such great company on the panel, and really look forward to seeing everybody's perspective on it. I thought it might just be useful as somebody from the outside to give a bit of perspective on kind of what this project and what these policies have meant, both on the enterprise and research side. I spent the vast majority of my academic career researching digital divide, and I think I started grad school in 2001. And at that time, it was very much a policy of data is offline and inaccessible unless there's a justification and reason for it being online and accessible. And as a researcher, that was a difficult environment to work in. And as a matter of fact, we ended up getting a lot of attention on our research just because of the fact we're able to manage and navigate the bureaucracy of getting data and aggregating it together to do research. And now having a policy of where this data is by default accessible and online to be worked with, unless there's a good reason to have it offline, has really changed the dynamics of how we interact with data, not only from a research perspective, but also from an entrepreneurial perspective. I mean, I think myself and I can think of a half dozen companies off the top of my head, both in DC and across the US, that have ended up starting companies creating jobs around open data. Right? When you begin to get to this onus of disconnecting presentation from the data itself, it really opens up an opportunity for folks to go take that data, remix it, repurpose it, and create value around it. And that's a really burgeoning economy both here in the district and across the country. I just got back from a conference in Portland all around opening up street data across the globe. There's a group called OpenStreetMap. And there are 300 folks that were just there in the US chapter alone, meeting in Portland on all the innovation going around open data and how to share that, remix it, build civic engagement around it, build businesses around it, and work across a wide variety of technologies and spans. And the broadband map, as folks have highlighted here, is a great example of the ability to successfully execute on that, and just the engagement that you see from citizens and from business engaging. 35 million uses of the API is just astounding, right? Think of this data. Whereas previously, and this is not long ago, we're talking a little over a decade, that one person getting access to that data was a significant effort. And going from a handful of researchers having to wind their way through a lot of bureaucracy to get a hold of data to now 35 million people accessing data is just an amazing change. And I think the impacts that I've seen personally, as well as in the direct economy, and it's not even so much statistics as it is personal use cases and experiences of seeing people doing amazing things and building amazing projects and building businesses and seeing those businesses flourish and grow is really an exciting thing. And so I think it really goes beyond just looking at the changes in bureaucracy to what's the changes in society that these initiatives are enabling. And I think it's really exciting. And I think the opportunities of how we're beginning to engage around open data continue to evolve. And I think it's just wonderful to see how the group of people at this panel and associated initiatives linked to it are continuing to evolve that technology and those concepts, and bringing in crowdsourcing to this project to really make it a bi-directional loop with citizens, I think is an area that's really flush with opportunity, where citizens can really engage around the data, more than, here's a site, go download some data and do something with it. How do I really engage citizens around making a bi-directional information loop, making them part of the information gathering and that virtuous loop of engagement with society through these kind of projects. It was interesting, there was a stat out last week that globally we're up to 6 billion mobile devices and 2.5 billion people on the internet, and all these are bi-directional opportunities to engage with people on how they're going about their daily lives and what are the needs and where can government and civil society engage with people across the globe to help improve society writ large. And I think this is a great example. Broadband has become such a fundamental utility for society that interconnects all these people. How can we really begin to tap into that? And then that really becomes an infrastructure on top of which just so much more engagement can exist as you have that infrastructure in place. And how do we begin to further plumb these bi-directional paths to engage and make things better across the board? And I think, this project and the open data policies that really began the session with are really great examples of how that not only creates a better society and better citizens, but also a stronger economy and stronger business. And it's just exciting to be part of the project and get to observe it grow, as well as engage with the data itself. It's just been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Ben?
So to paraphrase some wisdom I read on Twitter over the weekend, a house is not a home until you have broadband. And I think that's we were talking about the digital divide before. That was in the back of my head. But in terms of takeaways for the map itself, I think what struck me most is when we're done with it, you don't have to fold it and put it back in the glove department. So I thought that was really a big innovation right there. No. I think what the map really shows is that it's easier to do things right. It's easier to be lean. It's easier to be iterative. It's easier to be decentralized. The government's gotten really good at buying really expensive things, of building battleships. Because a battleship hasn't really changed all that much since it was originally invented. You need a hull, you need to make sure it doesn't leak, you need some guns, and you need a power source. Problem with, you can't apply that same model though to the internet, to the web, right? If I have a battleship, I need to spec everything out ahead of time, because if after it's built, I'm like, oh, actually we want the deck to be 5 feet wider, that's a really expensive thing to go back and change. Same if you're building a house, you give your architect specific plans, because if you want to put, another dishwasher in your kitchen, that's really expensive to do after the fact. When you're building a website, you don't have that same physical limitation. If once you have the website basically completely built, you're like, hey, actually we want the sidebar to be 5 pixels wider. We want it to be blue, and we want a print button. That's a really trivial cost, especially in terms of agile development. So I think that's one of the key takeaways, is that the government has to kind of retrain the way it approaches big problems to think smaller rather than think bigger. And I think a great example of how they did that is the API first model and making it very developer friendly. On the one hand, you make it friendly for internal developers, for the people actually building the project. So when Mike turns around at 11 o'clock at night and says, hey, we need this huge new feature, as a developer, I would be like, oh, okay, that's easy. We already have the API there. It's just a matter of kind of skinning a cool user interface on top of that. But the other side of that coin is then external developers, both in other business units, as in Greg's example, and also outside. So if I want to go, if I'm an entrepreneur and tomorrow I have some sort of great killer idea, I use the same API that the broadband map itself is using. It's not that there's this us versus them divide, that we have this blessed data and you can have the scraps, but it's you have raw access to the data itself just as anybody else. And I think the last takeaway is that small groups can create pockets of innovation. Right? It's not that the FCC was unique in any way, that it was blessed in any sort of way. It was just a group of well-intentioned people with a great idea that just didn't take no for an answer and just said, hey, nobody's saying no, why don't we just give this a try? And so I think a lot of times people are waiting for, oh, well, I have this, I have that. It's the pressure of bureaucracy, but I think it's a great example of showing that you don't need any special tools in order to kind of innovate and be an example. In terms of where I think the next step is, I think on a less geeky, less technological level, this really showcases the first of what I think we're going to see a lot of examples of public-private collaboration. Here we see it collaboration in both the data collection, and also we're starting to see it also in the data presentation and the data output. If open source is a great model of showing collaboration, but it's only data. And I think we're going to start seeing, as government gets more into open source and more into these kind of iterative projects, that we're going to start seeing more breaking down this us versus them distinction and seeing more examples of collaboration around data, around policy, around process, around data collection, and around code. And I think this is going to be the first of many examples that we see. And last, in terms of challenges that we still see, I came into government thinking that government was just lacking for geeks, that all the geeks were going to Silicon Valley, and the government just didn't know how to do things technically. And then at the FCC, a lot of the colleagues up here on the panel really taught me is that the technology is the easy part. That's not the hard problem. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's that there's this culture of that's just not how we do things, or a culture of people don't realize that it's possible to do things that way. So I think that this really is a great example, and hopefully the first of many cultural shifts that will allow that kind of technology that already exists. Because the private sector has already solved these problems a million times over in terms of APIs, in terms of decentralized, in terms of open source, in terms of agile. But that cultural shift necessary to bring that into government, I think that's a great example of what we're looking at here.
Thanks so much, Ben. That final point really leads in extraordinarily well to the first question that I had in my head, which is really, as you well put, a lot of the topic here is really about culture change. So what I'm wondering is, in addition to these projects, which come along every once in a while, and you have this great influx of sort of new people or new thinking, what can we do to really institutionalize that kind of change? What kind of things can we do, whether it's the digital government strategy or case studies like this? What can government do to help the rest of government really modernize? Just open up for any four of you guys. I mean, it's...
So, well, if one of I think the key parts of the equation, I mean, institutionalizing new mindsets is a really, really challenging thing. And it's as, from the OMB perspective, as we know and realize, it's very difficult to kind of create culture change by fiat. It's something that you need to really really focus on building tools to help accomplish that culture change. And so as right now we're working on, as I mentioned earlier, the development of the open data policy. One of the tactics that we're taking is we're laying out the principles and what we want to accomplish, but we're supplementing that with actual out-of-the-box, ready-to-go tools that we can drop into agencies and make available for anybody to use as they can. And so I think that's one of kind of the important pieces to highlight, is that it's you can't just demand culture change. You actually have to provide tools to create it.
Kind of priming the pump, so to speak. Yeah.
I think on a tactical level for the developers in the room, it's exactly that. It's leading by example, creating these discrete pockets of innovation, and then patching it up in such a way that you solve the problem once and you solve the problem anywhere. As an open source developer, maybe I'm scared to innovate and make that risk personally with my career. If I see another agency already use this technology, already built this useful tool, and it's just a matter of downloading it, spinning it up, and we're done, that helps me and gives me the air cover I need. On a more strategic level, it's about creating the culture of innovation and attracting the right people and the right mindset. That's from a management level. It's more lowering the power distance, lessening the levels of review. I think as Mike can probably tell you, it wasn't that every one of these iterations, it was like 50 people that had to sign a checkbox and sign off on. It was very much a very flat organization or flat group of people that was creating it. Changing the physical workspace. When we got in there, we started putting up pictures of the internet and like maps of IP addresses and just making it a geeky place. And this is the kind of thing that you don't generally see in government organizations. Last is both raising the bar, so saying just good enough for government is no longer good enough, which I think this is a great example of, and encouraging risk, encouraging people to fail and to fail quickly and to learn from that failure is something we don't normally see in government, but we see more in the private sector. So try even our own pockets, as I think Mike did a really great job with the broadband map, is to try to create a little microcosm of that culture within the office space.
Sean, Greg?
Yeah, I just, I think agreeing with what Ben said is, I think the people make such a big difference. And as a technologist, it's really easy to get wrapped around the technology side of things and, looking at open source, open APIs and data, which are all things that I love. But when it comes down to it, none of this plan would never have happened if it weren't for the people on this panel outside of myself. And it's really about attracting innovators into government. And, the program that Ben's part of with the Presidential Innovation Fellows is a wonderful example of that, right? How do you get people that have a new perspective, familiarity with technology, a passion about opening these kind of things up, and how do you bring them into government into oftentimes is a challenging environment where you have a lot of legacy and a lot of culture for doing things in a traditional way that has been pervasive for a long time and really institute and catalyze that kind of change. And I think so much of this has been predicated around bringing those right people into the process to initiate it. That as it says, in many ways the technology is the easy side, right? It's getting through that culture shift, and so much of culture is predicated by people. It's leaders that set a culture and drive a culture and change a culture. And I think as long as we continue to bring in great leaders to government to institute these kind of policies and shifts and changes, the more great examples like this we'll see.
Greg?
Are we being taped or not taped? We're on camera, okay. Want to choose my words carefully.
God, I really want to know what you're going to say now.
So first, I want to compliment Mike. And Mike and Ben both have a particular gift of good looks and hair, and they both have hair, which I think gives them a leg up in internal politics at organizations. No, Mike recanted to me a story where a question came up about a technology, and a technology was kind of imposed upon him early in the process, and Mike just said, "Great, we'll work with it." And I think over the course of getting very clear about what the requirements were and building some prototypes, he was actually able to say, there's a better tool to do this. And I don't quite have that gift. I, unfortunately, tend to say, no, that's a really stupid idea up front, rather than just kind of saying, great, I'll work with that, and then kind of find the reason that something could be better. So, and I think that Ben also has that gift. So what I've learned over the past couple of years working at the FCC is that this innovation change is hard. And trying to think that it's easy makes it harder. It is very much, it's necessary to respect the process that's in place, what everybody at the organization is dealing with, and find opportunities where you can move one person, two people, a small team to do something differently. And I think one of the things that over the past year, I've certainly embraced more, and I think that Mike and I had some conversations about that this is a very educational process. I think when I came into the FCC, which was in 2010, and the Obama administration had written the transparency memo that we're going to do this, and I was just coming from the Sunlight Foundation. And when I started with the Sunlight Foundation, it was really clear that people were still learning what Web 2.0 meant. What is a Web 2.0? What is semantic web? What is an API? And it was very clear that people would have to learn it. I think when I got to the FCC in 2010, I just thought by this time, everybody kind of understood it, and people that were talking about it and doing it. But in fact, progress has gotten much better when I've having come to realize that everybody has to learn to swim for themselves. So it doesn't matter if another agency has learned how to do it. It doesn't even matter if another bureau within an agency has figured out how to work this. Every single micro community that's going to be sharing information via APIs or working in an agile method or opening up to crowdsource has to go through the same learning curve that everybody else did. And they have to adopt it to their organizational needs and their structures. So I think the thing that I would say is that we will go faster if we kind of embrace how slow this is going to go and how much it is a person by person a learning experience, and each community has to figure out what it means for them to adopt it.
That's a really good point.
One thing that I saw that I just wanted to bring up is a narrative thread that went on throughout this is at every level the importance of collaboration. Collaborate, 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 collaborate. Because when it comes down to it, people really don't like it when the federal government hands them a standard and says, work with this. It goes exactly to what Greg was saying. Mike has the ability to just kind of put that aside and work his way towards the tool that he needs. But if you're really interested in instituting this kind of cultural reform, be open to working with different people. Be open to crowdsourcing inputs from citizens. Be open to trying to get technical expertise from a private sector company or another agency or someone else within your office. The more that people decide to go up in an office on the 10th floor and make a decision for everybody else, the less likely that anything that comes out of that is going to be durable. It's just not going to last unless there are more people in the room. So whenever you get an opportunity, collaborate.
I think that's exactly right. So, Greg, I want to touch on one thing that you just kind of said. That's this whole idea of people working through the process, no matter what. Everyone have to doing that. So, what are some of the benefits that we're seeing of open data, in addition to what we've already said, that allow that first baby step? I mean, one of the things that was interesting about Broadband Map, I think, that Zach sort of keyed in on is, there was a clear impetus, right? There was a congressional mandate, and NTIA did this great work with collaborating with states and setting up a wonderful program. But for others that don't have that massive influx, they have to start somewhere. What's the point of departure that allows them to go, oh, open data makes sense to me? How do I begin?
Well, so I'm going to point out something that Ben said about the power for the ability of the internal developers to work quickly. So I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity, but there's a special opportunity that happens when some developers that you're working with, people that are putting the application together and designers, build something and show it to you the next day or the next week after a conversation that you had. You kick around some ideas, you draw some stuff on the whiteboard, and then someone says, here's a URL where you can actually go play with this based on our ideas last week. There's a magic of how fast that happens. And the ability and design is, we don't really have any designers up here, but the importance of creating something beautiful, attractive, that articulates the idea that people are talking about, and then being able to see that embodied up on a web page or in a mock-up is extremely powerful. And the ability and I think what really gets people on board is when they can see their ideas quickly realized. It's not an idea that they have to wait a month or 2 months or 6 months, but they have an idea, they can vocalize it, and the next day that map is there, that interaction is there, that form is there, and they can see how it works. And the open data internally makes it very easy for the development community to be responsive to the mission part of the organization. And that's what gets the mission people on board, is because they feel like, wow, you've made my idea better. You know, I'm the playwright, and you actors have read it and made it more interesting, and you brought it to life. And so I think that that's the first step. And in most of the successful projects, it has always come down to whether it's Ben hacking something up, or it's Mike doing something, or it's a map that's possible by Fortius, or some other interaction like, hey, we did this over the weekend, as Haley was describing. These are all things that say, oh my God, that is different. And that is faster, and I want to do that more and more.
Other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, other than, you know, on the design side, it is critical. I mean, in many ways, it's how do we make data come alive for folks, right? And to a certain extent, and it's always a bit of a trade-off, right? Of if you don't necessarily want the government in the business of providing the complete end product, that, you know, there's a lot of power that comes in making that data available in a raw format for folks to remix and repurpose and do their own thing with. But there's also kind of an impedance mismatch of the number of people that know how to do something with data versus the number of people that know how to consume the data. And then of those people that know how to consume the data, how many people actually really know how to interpret the data? And I think that's, you know, it's a gap that really goes beyond, you know, just an agency or a policy. But, you know, one of the big things that I've always had a problem with spending a lot of time in open data is, you know, the percentage of the population that really knows how to understand and appreciate that data and can take advantage of it, you know, because just from an educational perspective and facilness with statistics, we really kind of limit the number of people that can take advantage of all these great things that we do, right? And so that's part of, you know, within a digital divide, there's also a data divide or statistical divide of the number of people that can really take advantage and understand these things. And it's another thing I don't really have an answer for directly, but I think that concept of design and understanding how people consume these things and understand them is another critical part. And it's, you know, one part government of how do we get policies in place for more people to understand and consume these things? How do we do better consumption and presentation? And how do we repurpose this data to allow a whole variety of people to provide different perspectives and angles on it, just to get more of the purpose of the data in the first place? You know, why do we create this data? Because we want to educate people about policy and make them smarter citizens that make better decisions. And I think that's still a really big challenge. You know, the first step is opening the data, right? Until it's open, we really can't do anything with that. But how do we go beyond that next step of, okay, there's data, how do we get more people consuming and understanding it and being better engaged citizens as a result, or better businesses, or better citizens?
Ben or Haley, anything else?
I think when it comes to the starting point of open data and how to operationalize that at agencies, it's the most important thing is to emphasize that it's okay to start small. While in a perfect state, yes, we'll be engineering systems to be, you know, producing open data by default from the start. That's a big ask, though. And even at the programmatic level or the bureau level, it's okay to start small. And first place to start is, I think, focusing on data sets that are of the most use and high value to your customers, whatever that customer may be. And the most important kind of second step is, sorry to use the word ecosystem, but looking at kind of how that data interacts, not, you know, across the board, and building, you know, just releasing data isn't going to get you that far. But if you release data and focus on cultivating a community around developing on top of that data and using that data, I think you'll be surprised to see how quickly you can create results, which is what is the biggest leverage to take back to program leaders and secretaries and whatnot at agencies, and kind of developing those stories of, we had a simple data set that was highly used by our customers, whether that's an internal customer or an external customer. We released it in ways that was most usable for them, and these are the applications that were built on top of it. Is a beautiful circle to be able to articulate and tell to leadership, and that's kind of where I would start at an open data level.
I think Haley brings up a great point, that top-down air cover, saying, you know, this is the ideal way to do things, is awesome, but that's not going to solve the problem. At the end of the day, we need to get the geeks excited about this kind of cool stuff that we're doing. We need to get geeks excited about open source and APIs and maps and GIS and the power of collaboration, the power of open data, and what we can do with this technology, and not just hey, here's a contract, go build this thing, but actually get the geeks both in government and that support government efforts really excited about the kind of work we're doing here. So I don't know if that's, bringing in TED-style talks into government or, funding for more conferences about learning about this kind of cool stuff. But while top-down air cover is necessary, it's not sufficient. We need to get people excited about doing the right thing. And I think it's a good example of that.
That's a great point.
One little anecdote for that is when I was at USAID, I was working on kind of a campaign to raise awareness around the famine in the Horn of Africa. And one of the big pushes that we wanted to do was to create, actually put data into the narrative of the famine, and actually use data to describe what was happening on the ground in the Horn of Africa. And we were tracing, different rain patterns and population transitions, and we used that to create this really fascinating story. And we did it through using open mapping tools and opening up the data that was supporting those maps that we used to kind of articulate why we were driving the policy perspectives that we were. And I was incredibly excited to have these maps be using kind of open source technology and opening up the data behind it, and was trying to work into the administrator's speech a bunch of key points on open data and how cool this was. And everyone was like, no one cares about this. Like, why? What does that even mean? Like, we just think that there's a pretty map, and and I was trying to articulate how great it was going to be that these maps were open and were going to be able to be used by whoever wanted to use them in their own blog posts and on their own web pages. And that in and of itself was also really hard to describe the value of that. And a lot of the policymakers were like, but this is our map. This is what we developed. Why would we want other people to take this and run with it? And sure enough, we published the maps. We do have open data worked into the speech. And as a result, we started being able to trace and see all of the places that these maps were being integrated and used to spread the same message that we were talking about at the one campaign's website, at all these various blogs and whatnot. And it finally clicked, and there was this aha moment for the program owners and the policymakers when they realized that this enabled the message that they were sharing to be spread in a dynamic way faster than they ever could. And the requirement there was for them to give up control. And so again, just finding those little examples where you can articulate that in meaningful ways to the program offices and the policymakers is a very, very helpful start.
I think that's a great point. That it's part of it's a branding problem. I mean, like, this is cool stuff. This is sexy stuff that we're doing, and like, so no government agency is ever going to be like, oh no, we shouldn't be doing social media, because social media is the cool thing right now. And I think that either if we can get it or it's going to happen, that you're going to have some sort of administrator come and be like, my cousin and my nephew mentioned something about the open source. We should be on the open data. We should be doing the open data. And like, make it cool and make it the next big thing, because I think we in this room all realize that that's what it is. And it's just a matter of kind of getting that cool, sexy mindset out into the right people that can make the decisions.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the things I want to hit Sean up next on is it feeds right into this well. We've seen, and you in particular have done a lot of work in the bi-directional kind of way, the crowdsourcing opportunity that allows new feedback to come in, whether it's a big event like Haiti or the tsunami in Japan. What other opportunities are we seeing? Because it's not just the big event, right? We're seeing it across the board in multiple avenues. So talk about some of the new opportunities we're seeing in crowdsourcing that can facilitate the kind of sexy thing that Ben's talking about.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things we've been really excited about is just how more dynamic the feedback loops can be. I mean, a lot of what we had traditionally seen was people finding different data sets and re-amalgamating those to tell new stories, which is a powerful concept in and of itself. I mean, that Horn of Africa map, I remember taking the tiles, bringing it in, and we were doing some other work with the World Bank that had feedback on projects of where they were investing, and instantly being able to combine those two things together on the fly and all of a sudden have a great perspective from USAID, World Bank, and fusing them together. And it gave a whole new perspective on that. But then really going the next step is what has us incredibly excited, is then to have that dynamic feedback loop to citizens. So there is a project that we kicked off as a prototype called On Track, where folks could, in the Horn of Africa, SMS text in their feedback to those projects, and if it was impacting them in a positive or negative way. How was that money being spent? Was it effective? Was it making a difference on the ground for those citizens as they go through and live their daily lives? And I think that ability to have those dynamic feedback loops is really exciting. But so much of what we traditionally do, both as a government agency and in private industry, especially in the geospace, but really data space in general, is we get a big set of data, we munge that data, we do some analysis, We come up with a report, we post that report, everybody looks at it, and it's basically a post-mortem, right? We're looking after the fact, what happened, how could we do it better next time? But the reality is that, now data is being dynamically generated, thousands of bits of information per second. Is it in the last 2 years, more data has been generated than in all of history preceding it. And a lot of that is because of 6 billion mobile devices that are all pushing out data exhaust on what people do on a daily basis. And the concept that that data is dynamic means that our analysis can also be dynamic, right? It's not so much that we have a static snapshot that says what it was over the last 6 months. We can say, what is it right now? What is it that we see emerging? What is it that we see developing? And sometimes that's active, like with OnTrack, where folks are SMSing in and saying that, this project is impacting me in a negative way, and I'm sending it direct to that authoritative source. Other times it's very passive, massive social media networks where folks are just discussing how things are impacting them in their daily lives, and the ability to kind of passively look at that and understand these feedback loops, which all means that our analysis can be dynamically updating, right? As this new information streams in from sensors, from mobile devices, from text messages, from social media, is the ability that we can do perpetual analysis and understand when things change and things update and alert people out and bring them back in to what it was that they were looking at. A lot of what we think about is, the Horn of Africa map as a great example of, people look at that and they come away with a great conclusion and they see that there's a problem and they want to engage about it, but most of the time I then walk away and leave and I go back to my daily life and I don't think about that again. Really think about the ability of, as that data is streaming through, that when there's big changes and all of a sudden, the drought shifts down by another 10% and there's another 50,000 people that have been displaced, what if I got an alert back to me saying, hey, the Horn of Africa map has gone in a bad direction. You should go back and re-engage and really understand what's happening around it. Or there was a big policy success and there's money on the ground and it made a big difference, and all of a sudden 10 villages now have water, and I want to re-engage and understand what's happening there. And this evolution in data really provides that opportunity that what we do around open data can really become this sticky viral thing that constantly re-engages us and really makes it part, instead of this one-off that I see and then I move on to my next attention deficit disorder thing, which is, Bravo TV, right, and then something else. How can we continually bring people in to engage, I think is a really exciting opportunity as we move forward in open data in general.
I just want to jump in. Sean was saying a lot about the real-time nature, and I think the web very much is a real-time medium as well as a kind of an archive. And some of what that means is that there's a lot of data that we tend to work with in federal government which is not real-time, because the data has been collected for a long period of time, starting with paper collections where it could never be real-time in the first place. And so making some choices, realizing that if you're working with data that's not real-time or not close to real-time or is not updated on a periodic basis like the National Broadband Map, some of the effects that exist and some of the dynamics that exist around the internet are not immediately going to come to that data that's incredibly static. It's really the projects in which there is some type of real-time feedback loop that create the opportunities for these impacts and effects. And so I think a lot of us start with data that's easy, which happens to be static data, and then people say, well, nothing happened. And that's because it doesn't have the potential for that feedback loop in the first place.
So, I mean, one of the things that it seems to me, listening to this, is that in the government space, to kind of spur some of that on, there has to be a secret sauce that allows the people in programs to go, oh, the new thing that would allow for that real-time feedback is X, right? So it's seeing the opportunity in the nexus between this data collection as it existed under some Paperwork Reduction Act and the opportunity for that real-time feedback, right? So I mean,
which is the real game changer.
Which is the game.
But the point is it's not. I think that some of the journey is discovering what the secret sauce is for that particular application or that particular mission, and that there's not a single secret sauce that you can pull off the shelf, but it's the discovering. Well, what is going to be the secret sauce, which is going to make the feedback loop meaningful in this occasion?
Right.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the vast majority of data is static and is likely to continue to be static, you know, and I think it's going to take a long kind of evolutionary process before core government data becomes real time. But I think there's an immediate opportunity in that citizens are real time. And citizens are engaging with data and policy issues in real time. And they're doing it through existing networks, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, or just mobile applications, right? And there's the ability to tap into those existing real-time networks to constantly get people to re-engage around issues and data as things evolve. So I think there's both, you know, long-term opportunities, but also quick wins as far as really plumbing into these existing networks to generate these dynamic feedback loops. We don't necessarily need to build them all the time. A lot of times it makes a ton of sense because you need specialty information, like with the broadband map, and that ends up being a brilliant way to do it. And then I think oftentimes there's other ways to re-engage through existing networks that we can tap into. And the nice thing, since as everything moves to an API level, you can mix and match these APIs in a fluid manner, which really allows these things to get baked rapidly. Again, going back to that agile iterative process, you know, you begin to test out these other APIs against public data APIs and see where these quick wins can be made.
So I'd like to ask one last question, and then we'll open it up to sort of the floor for questions. But so one consistent theme in all of your comments and everyone's feedback is, I would boil down to time to market, right? The opportunity for us to have really, really fast feedback to either the program owner or the public about what that thing is. And one of the ways that was clear in this case through Zach's articulation is visualization through maps. But that's clearly not the only visualization that we're seeing in the internet landscape. So Sean, you kind of made the point of, you know, data coming alive, and you know, the consumer having to have some knowledge base about basic understanding of some of those data. And in some cases, let's be honest, it's really, really dry to look at a table of rows and columns when that gets over, like, say, 15 rows, right? You've got like this overwhelming sense of just numbers, and not everyone thinks that way. But what are the other things on the landscape, in addition to, you know, dynamic maps, that allow us to visualize some of that data? And are there opportunities there that allow for that really, really fast time to market and feedback to consumers?
Tag clouds. Just make everything a tag cloud.
So talk about that,
No,
Ben.
don't make tag clouds.
Anyone?
I think some of the most interesting things that I've seen with interacting with data actually have most recently have not been visual, right? Is the concept of eventing. You know, as I come into an area, I get alerted or notified driven by data. Right? You know, so you go into an area and I get evented on what is the broadband speed in this area. Say I'm on a real estate tour, right? And I'm going around looking at different houses. You know, it may not be convenient to me to go look at a map, look at a table, and try to drive these things, but I could say, as I'm going on this real estate tour, you know, alert me on things that are critical. So if I go into a new neighborhood that all of a sudden has double the broadband speed of where I was, push alert and let me know about it, right? And again, it's these kind of lowering the threshold for how we engage and consume something, and kind of getting to that lowest common denominator, I think, is a huge opportunity. And then, you know, definitely diving into visualization itself and make it more interactive and driven. But, you know, I think the general trajectories of society is, you know, generally speaking, people really don't want to dive in and understand an issue unless we give them a compelling reason to do so. Right. And so I think we have to start with that thing that, you know, that gets onto their radar and drags their attention from the dozen other things they're looking at. And then there's a willingness to really dive into it. So I get that alert and then say, wow, why is it double the broadband speed here? What else do I want to know? And then I might want to look at a map. I might want to look at a table. Kind of that perspective.
So there is, I was able to find it. There is a great data visualization by the New York Times called "How Mariano Rivera Dominates Hitters." Right. So are you familiar with this one?
No.
So this is I would recommend everybody to go take a look. You know, take a look at this. It's Mariano Rivera Dominates Hitters, and it's just a story. But there's this moment in the data visualization where it shows how about 50 or 100 pitches all came across the plate, and I think that's a takeaway that you can get in a few seconds or a couple minutes investments about this individual pitcher's performance that it's very hard to see if you're just looking at the table of information. The power of doing some visualizations is that you can highlight something about a story and get people interested in something that might, that other, that, I could say, if a person is trained in the field, training in I'm switching tactics here a little bit. If you're a trained engineer, you have the ability to look at numbers, look at designs, and translate that into a visual picture in your head. Just like if you're a musician, you can, and you know how to read music, you can read a score and you can hear the music because you've been trained. What a data visualization does is provide you a connection with the data even if you don't have the formal training to create that picture yourself. And so the power of some of these visualizations, and I would recommend this one, is that when you have a good one, what you can do is you can communicate the essence or part of a story to other people who don't happen to have the same training and background that you have in order to see that themselves from the raw information.
And that's exactly what being able to have the map did for the Connect America Fund, because you don't have to say, like, this community has less broadband resources than everybody else. You bring up the map and the gap is right there for everybody to see. That kind of visual representation is extremely powerful.
And it's not the end-all answer,
Right.
right? It's not the end-all answer, but it helps get a lot of people who have different skills roughly on the same page to talk about something.
And I think Greg touched on a really important point. Think practically about how these projects come about. It's, you have boss man comes down and says, hey, we need to measure X, we need to map Y. Right, and so if you get the geeks in the room and they just put out an API, you're like, look, here it is, it's awesome, look at all this data, and boss man, not trained classically to be able to hear the scores, like, that's just numbers, what is that? And so politically, you can't point to that and say, look at this awesome thing I did, because it's ugly, at least for the outside world, it's ugly, it's not, it's just an API. So, hey, look, here's our developer documentation, doesn't score any political points. But if you can put even a very light layer on top of that of like, look, yeah, you can get JSON, you can XML, add .html, and here's just a plain black and white representation, just so that there's something to point to, all of a sudden you change the dynamic, and now in the press release, in the whatever it is, you can say, look, there's the data right there, and I think that really changes the game. And that's why you'll see certain things that'll be just APIs that don't really take off, and then you have the kind of the norm of building entire websites or microsites, because that's, the visual is where you get the political punch from, even though you get kind of the more efficacious punch from the API. And I think a great example of that is GSA's social media registry, which just put out a Rails app. So as a developer, I go in, I have half a page of documentation. Okay, here's how I make a call. But I can also then send that to somebody who's not classically trained to read sheet music to be like, look, just add .html, and here's just black and white. Here's the name of the Twitter account, and here's a link to it.
Yeah, perfect.
And I think that really speaks to one of the big things we've been hitting on here, which is the incredible importance of decoupling data from presentation. One of, we recently actually released the OMB budget in machine readable formats, and what that enabled us to do is engage the public to help develop these visualizations, right? There's certain things government's good at, and there's certain things that they're not. More often than not, with the exception of beautiful projects like the National Broadband Map, which are very well designed, hate to say it, but more often than not, the government does not design very pretty things. That's one of the talents and kind of in the rapidly evolving space around visualization that the private sector does very, very well, and we kind of tend not to do well. To do well would require bringing in high-skilled designers into government and kind of contracting specific use of designers. What I'd rather do is open up the data and enable the people who do that well to run with it and do what they do best, and let government do what we do best, which is develop things like the budget, which are just massive data sets, and open that in ways that it enables the private sector to add value to it through visualization or whatever it might be.
Thanks so much. We have about 10 minutes, I think, left, and love to open up the floor to any
Jim,
questions.
you've been doing a great job tonight.
Yeah, right here. We have a mic. Right here, Leah.
Oh, it's behind you.
Oh.
Thanks. I'm with the Organization for the Promotion and Advancement of Small Telecommunications Companies. We're a group of about 450 rural carriers out in the high-cost areas of the country where it's most expensive to get broadband services out there. The notion that that CAF is going to be funneled or targeted based on the map is, frankly, at this moment a concern. That's not to take away from the effort that's gone into this. We were supportive of the BDIA, and there were a lot of issues that we think were solved along the way, and problems that we think government engaged very nicely and productively in fixing before things got too far down the road. That being said, a lot of what's on the map is extrapolated from data. And where you have lots of numbers, that tends to smooth out. In rural areas where it's very sparsely populated, you don't have that. So we have filed back in January a number of questions, a number of problems with the map. And I would, was very appreciative of Mr. Gorman's comments about constructive engagement and feedback and things like that. So while we could go down a long list of specifics, maybe the best, given time is, what's the best way to engage in some constructive feedback where we can bring up our concerns with some of the problems that remain in the map before it actually gets down to CAF funding? Because frankly, right now, the prospect that this is going to be used for funding is actually impeding people from investing.
Sure, I think there's two things on this one, although it's slightly different than the topic of conversation today. One, the process you already mentioned, FCC engages in the Administrative Procedure Act to guide almost all of its process. So that's a very open process of filing comments on open dockets, coming in for ex parte meetings, and raising the issues as you've seen. And I can tell you from experience that what we've seen in that is a very high degree of use in data to help support evidence in both capacities. And two, given that the way NTIA has really structured this function of understanding this very collaborative approach across federal government, state government who are awardees and recipients of that, state governments implementing validation processes to ensure that the data they're collecting is appropriate, and that the data source is actually from the providers who are providing broadband in those local areas, to make sure that you engage at both the NTIA level and the states that you might think that there is particular concern. So,
I'd also like to throw in there really quick. All of us here really, we are in service to policy. We're doing data in service to policy, which means that we're not actually setting the policy. And I think the important thing about the National Broadband Map in many respects is that it has enabled certain policy undertakings to take place or to be within the realm of discussion, which would have been much more problematic without them. So now, and I think as Haley has been saying about separating presentation from the data, there's also separating policy from the data. It is pretty easy for us to engage in conversations and events which are about data and not about policy, right? At some point, almost all data does have a policy component, and it's important to recognize that we operate inside of that environment and what comes with it. But when we are all very eager to go to events that other people organize to find out what is right and what is wrong with the data that we're working with, and to find out what needs people have. And we have started to have some success having get-togethers with a single group or with a consortium where we're talking about the data and about what we can do and what questions people have. The more politicized that happens to be, or the more policy-oriented, the less we get to be in the front dealing with the issues. So if that's helpful at all.
There's another question over here.
It's not for us to say.
Okay, I have two questions. First, about culture. The physicist Max Planck is famous, one of the creators of quantum mechanics is famous for saying that progress occurs one funeral at a time. And I'm sure you've all seen it, I've seen in industry. Really good, forward-looking projects are just shut down by somebody with an old agenda who is up in a position of authority. I'm wondering if there's anybody who's looking into ways of actively removing these obstacles to progress. Which means,
like I said, there's policy and then there's data.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Actively finding ways to do that. That's something that's worth looking into. That's
I think the food in the FCC cafeteria is working on
that. It works on everybody equally. And the second question is, in the executive branch and whichever offices you're working in, what operating system is on your computers?
Yeah, so the first one, anyone want to?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there has been, that this administration has brought in a significant effort to try to change that, right? From the executive memo of open government to now the digital
memorandum on social media as well.
The memorandum on social media to the digital strategy platform, which has specific tasks making people do as a way of creating a space for some of the, for newer thinkers and other invitations to have an opportunity to do stuff and not be shut down as fast. So there's no question that that is one path where there's an attempt to create space and to create it. It is, I think, like I said, though, that it's one path. I think at the other level, all groups have to learn how to do this themselves. And so it is a matter of people getting together and working through it. There's no question that I think that we have not figured out how to do it at a large scale with legacy systems. That is still a very wide open question that we're running into. And so we are doing it more with the greenfield applications, with smaller groups, et cetera, et cetera.
Anyone else on the first question?
I mean, other than I think it's a problem that's, not endemic to just government.
Yes.
So somebody has gone from a 15-person company to a several thousand-person company in the last couple of months. It's something that plagues every organization. And I think so much of it is exactly what we're saying here is going to the white space, right? You're much more likely to be able to innovate and move in places where somebody doesn't feel like they already have a territorial stake. And then when you're able to succeed in those things, then it gives a lot more leverage and clout to then go back to those things that were off limits and say, hey, look at the example of this, see how well it succeeded. Maybe we should look at moving everybody else towards this in an iterative way. But that goes to the legacy challenge, right? And I think it's going to take several broadband map successes before folks go and say, yeah, the legacy needs to change, right? I mean, look how much more benefit you're getting out of the broadband maps of the world than you are the procurement systems of the world, right?
One thing I would say is, what this reminds me in particular is a quote from Governor Jim Geringer, who works with Esri and has been really wonderful with the Commons Lab in the past. I was discussing with him, I asked him a similar question in terms of when you're going in and you're trying to explain why GIS is so powerful to a policymaker, what's the approach to take? And what he said was that instead of going in and trying to sell the $2 million satellite, you sell them a feature. You sell them a particular function that you know is going to benefit them, and then you build your services out from there. That's agile policy in my mind. The idea that policy, it's not just the technical processes that need to be iterative, but it's the gradual comfort level, getting people piece by piece used to the idea of, okay, well, this actually can benefit me, adding a function on from there, adding a function on from there to the point where hopefully down the road we're at a generally better technology and policy place for everybody.
And on the second question, I'll answer this for everyone just because I think it would be hard to do that without, say, survey. But I think one of the things that we've seen again, in agile space is one is typically bad. One offers a single point of failure. And I know in our environment, we're operating no fewer than 4 OSs across our spectrum, whether that's on my desktop or in serving environments. So when we see an environment that offers more than one, you see a better opportunity for innovation. Oh, one more question? Anyone?
What's next?
What's next? So what's next? That's great, Leah. Anyone? What are the next things on the horizon that we see?
At what scale? GitHub is next. If that doesn't mean anything to you, great, because it's next. It's a good thing to kind of figure out. One of the most significant things that has happened over the last 4 years is that the browser has become an incredibly powerful, robust piece of software. It is no longer a piece of software for displaying an HTML page that is served up from the server. It is a thick client with incredible computing power inside of a sandbox that runs on your computer. What does that mean? What it means, as we just did this past weekend, is that I can push 250,000 rows of data from the server into the browser as data. Not as HTML, not formatted in any way, but 250,000 rows I can push as data directly into the browser, and I can have the code running fast enough in the browser to turn that into a data visualization. This is a very big deal because it means that all I have to, is I have a much more direct connection between my browser and between my data that's sitting in a database. And I don't need as much of the crap that's in between. So we're seeing some interesting trends away. Ben has written a very interesting little bit about this, away from the content management system that's in the middle that used to prepare all that content and put it out there, to just kind of let's push that data into the browser and let the browser do stuff with it. Now, what that also means is that suddenly that browser that I'm using could also be a mobile application, or it could be something that's running on a mobile device. So I think that that's one of the biggest things that we're looking at right now. And it also means it's like, I'm not a mobile guy because I grew up in the era where the web was big. So this stuff continues to change incredibly fast. So I think that that's the other challenge is simply keeping up. The victories of Web 2.0 in federal government, which we have had, is also a demonstration of that we're not necessarily keeping up the new things that have happened since Web 2.0.
Well, I guess two things. I mean, one, kind of running with the GitHub analogy, which is collaborative coding, right? Is the concept that you have a community of people contributing and evolving a core set of software tasks. And it was interesting is how did that same principle begin to permeate other areas of technology and also potentially policy, right? What's the potential for collaborative policy with engaging with multiple stakeholders through a technological and communications framework? I think is one side that is an interesting potential future direction. I mean, and a lot of this is how does technology permeate into society and really change the processes and the ways that we do things? And as it's been said, as we bring the geeks to government, right, how do we begin to see not only the actual widgets and code that people write, but the processes in which they do it, which is a very egalitarian, horizontal process that's highly collaborative, right? And how do we begin to see these same processes come into the actual governance of what we do? The second thing is education, and one of the things I've really learned in the process of doing a lot of open data crowdsourcing work is that the efficacy of that work is only as powerful as the audience that can engage with it. And I think we're really beginning to see the beginning of a renaissance in education with things like Coursera and Khan Academy, which are these open, free web platforms that allow you to go take courses at Stanford, MIT, University of Michigan for free. And you do crowd editing of each other's papers, and you have guidelines for doing that. And Khan Academy is the same concept, but for learning to code. Same things for learning to understand data, right? And all these things that we do are only as powerful as the audience that can appreciate them. And so what can we really do to engage, to educate more people to understand and participate in these things? Because otherwise we're just creating additional divides, right? And I think that's a really big future direction that has a lot of opportunity both in government and within business and technology. And it's great seeing both sides drive towards that, even though it's all fairly new.
The next thing we're going to start to see is more collaboration. We're all on the same team, whether it's across business units, it's across the government, or it's between the public and the private sector. So when asked what the next big thing is, I always like to look to the geeks, right? The geeks kind of have a good sense of what's up, and if you look at hashtags in IRC, Twitter, and you see track, and you kind of see the open source tools. And so right now, all the geeks are talking about GitHub. And the secret sauce of GitHub is what's called a pull request, right? So when Wikipedia was first popular, everyone's like, Wikipedia is going to change government. We're going to have collaborative policy. But the scary thing about Wikipedia is that it's very flat, right? So I can go to any Wikipedia page and edit it. And so from a traditional policy perspective, to say, hey, we're going to put the law online and let everybody edit it is problematic. But what GitHub solves that with is two levels of control. You'll have contributors, which have the ability to actually edit the code, in this case, maybe a federal agency or a policymaker, and then you have just the general public that can always submit a proposed change, right? So you take that kind of model, not just with code, with data, with policy, with process, with everything. That kind of pull request model of, hey, anyone in the world can see the behind the scenes, the man behind the curtain, and can propose a fix to that, and then it's up to the agency to facilitate that discussion, and then either accept or deny that request. I think that's where we're going to be heading. And the way we get there is communities, right? So the way the government approaches open data and open source is very different than the way the rest of the world approaches open source, or popular open source projects approach open source. It's not, hey, we've solved the problem, here's the source code. It's, hey, we're hoping to tackle this problem. Let's build a community around the problem. Not just developers, but user experience experts, subject matter experts, make mechanisms of horizontal communication so that the community can can survive in and of itself, and then eventually we'll solve the problem and eventually we'll get the code. So open source, open data, open collaboration from the start throughout both code, process, and policy.
Similar, but what I'm very excited for is a kind of a fundamentally new understanding of what it means to participate in government and what civic participation is. You know, in the past, that's been voting. It still is, and it will continue to be. There's participating in public discussion and being part of these open regulatory processes. But what the revolution we're experiencing now is that for the first time, citizens actually have the possibility and the opportunity to build services for their government and to actually take ownership in helping make government more efficient and effective for its citizens. And I'm incredibly excited for revisiting that conversation about civic participation, so we can exalt and hold up these citizen developers who are not just asking for government to be better, but actually helping make government better.
Excellent. So I'm fired up. Thank you guys so much for attending today, and really appreciate all of the panel's input. It's been fantastic, and really appreciate Zach's hard work and dedication in writing this great case study. So thanks for attending, everyone.